My next guest is Congressman Stephen Horsford, a Democrat from Nevada and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.
So we are 60 years outside of the first March on Washington. Just tell me a little bit about what you're reflecting on in this moment.
Well, as you stated, the 60th commemoration, it's really a continuation of the fight for jobs and freedom, for justice and equality, something that leaders before us, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, set as the priority for our country to live up to. And we're still fighting today to honor the commitment, the vision, the legacy of the 60th anniversary march. I'm proud to join with my colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus, who will be participating on the march on Saturday. The actual anniversary commemoration will be on Monday, but the march will be participating in Washington, D.C. This Saturday.
Yeah, and you know, one person that I think everybody thinks of at this moment is, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also I can't help but think of John Lewis, who at the time was in his 20s, and he got up on that stage and he spoke on behalf of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had some strong words, including for the Kennedy administration. And you know, of course, we know that he would go on to be a champion for voting rights, especially in the House of Representatives, and I know that that's something really important to the CBC, especially this year. Can you just touch on why voting rights are so instrumental when we think about the March on Washington and the work that you guys are doing this year?
Yeah. Well, thank you for lifting up the late Congressman John Lewis, who will always remain as my hero and a civil rights icon for the work that he led as a civil rights leader, as a young student. It's always going to start with the young people, and throughout his career as a public servant in the House of Representatives. And as you noted, democracy is fragile. It's under attack. We are living through a moment right now when there are efforts to undermine education, particularly public education. The stacking of our courts and the decisions that are being made by the federal judiciary, including the United States Supreme Court. And then the most important right and institution within our democracy, which is our voting system and having fair and free elections, which sadly we are seeing being eroded by state legislatures, by now a four-time convicted former president of the United States, and others who still cannot agree that they lost the election in 2020. And yet we have another election that we need to prepare for and make sure is secure and protected.
Absolutely. And, you know, you touched a little bit on this, but I think one thing that is undeniable this year is there's been some debates over how to teach about Black history, about how to teach about or recognize Black identity. How does that, in your opinion, is it affecting how the CBC is approaching this commemoration this year?
Well, earlier this year in April, I convened a national summit on democracy and race. The Congressional Black Caucus convened leaders across the country in Washington. During that time, we talked about the issues from the erasure and the rewriting of history, including Black history, which is U.S. history. The undeniable fact that slavery is not a benefit that somehow helped people acquire skills, no matter what is suggested by Ron DeSantis and others in Florida. But beyond that, it's also the attacks on the expulsion of representatives like Justin Jones and Justin Pearson out of Tennessee for speaking up for their constituents who want to be safe from gun violence in their communities. It's, as I said, the packing of our federal judiciary. And that is why after that summit, we announced and just concluded, in fact, a summer of action called Democracy for the People through the Congressional Black Caucus Institute. And we traveled the country. We hit about 14 cities. Again, we will commemorate that at the 60th anniversary. And what we did is we had town hall meetings. We talked directly to the people that we represent. We had organizing sessions to help people understand their power and agency in this moment and to really empower them with the tools and the resources that they need to organize in their local community, including to help with voter registration and voter turnout for next year. But nothing matters more than people understanding that this democracy belongs to all of us. It's not some archaic thing that only applies to a certain few, to the well-connected and to the well-off. It includes all of us. And the institutions of our democracy are the fundamentals that we're working to defend in this moment.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me think, you know, when we talk about the March on Washington, or when many of us learn about it in school, of course we hear about the I Have a Dream speech, you know, this seminal speech that was so important, but we often focus on that line about, you know, I have a dream, my children, you know, judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Looking back on the march, do you think that there are messages perhaps that we overlook that maybe we want to talk about or bring up more this year as we're looking at some of these attacks on Black history?
Well, I think a big part of what the march was 60 years ago and what it still remains today as priorities are around jobs. It's around economic opportunity. It's around fair and safe and secure housing. It's around wealth building in our communities so that there really is economic opportunity and prosperity that, again, is not just limited to the very few, but is something that is really promised to everyone, regardless of what zip code we live in. It is absolutely about education. And at a time when the Supreme Court would make a decision to deny and take away opportunities to have access to education because of the elimination of race-based preferences in affirmative action, we now have to do more to ensure that young people and parents alike know that education at this moment is critically important. And institutions like historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions have to be supported and funded so that those opportunities are available to everyone.
Yeah, and as you just mentioned, with the original March on Washington, you know, it was called March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I'm curious, how do we compare the two? How did those two link together? How do jobs influence freedom or freedom influence jobs when we think about that?
Well, I just participated in a forum with leaders called the Black Economic Forum with the Executive Leadership Conference and other organizations, including the Black Economic Alliance. And I want to say this very clearly. You know, my job is to represent the Congressional Black Caucus, and we believe that when we uplift Black people, we uplift everybody. And that's something that Dr. King and others believed as well. We need economic policies in this country that help lift everyone out, and specifically Black people who, because of systemic racism, from enslavement to Jim Crow era policies to the mass incarceration of Black people to this day, we are still working to dismantle these institutions that have not provided equity and opportunity for everyone. That includes jobs. That includes the freedom for women to make their own healthcare decisions and young people to be able to live in communities free from gun violence, and where climate is actually a priority, not just a talking point in a debate. So these are the things that we're still working on and fighting for. It's what the Congressional Black Caucus stands for as the conscience of the Congress. And while there may be people on the other side that are more focused on special interest, we're focused on putting people over politics.
And so going off of that, then, you know, we've been in this fight since Africans were brought here as enslaved peoples. So looking at that, thinking about that, that was hundreds of years ago at this point. We're now 60 years outside of the March on Washington, which was 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. What words of advice or encouragement could you give, particularly when we're looking at young folks who are coming up now, not just in the streets and advocating, but also to the ballot box?
Thanks, Cheyanne. It's such an important question. And, I did have the honor of joining Leader Jeffries earlier this year to go to Ghana as part of his first international trip as the leader in the House Democratic Party and Caucus. And we visited the slave dungeons and sat at the steps of the door of no return. And so to suggest somehow we have not made progress, I reject that notion. I know we have. We've elected President Barack Obama. We have Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Families are free to live largely where they want, and there are opportunities in education. But what we're fighting for is something bigger. It's not a floor. We're fighting for an opportunity for people to be able to live freely, to build legacy, to have wealth, to be able to pass down things to their children and their children's children. And that's simply what Black people want, like anyone else. So yes, it is about jobs, it's about freedom, and it's about the cornerstones of what produce a quality life. That is what Martin Luther King Jr. Fought for, spoke about, marched for, and it's why we are still continuing that march. I want to commend Dr. Martin Luther King III, as well as the Reverend Al Sharpton, who are organizing this year's march. The Congressional Black Caucus stands as partners with them and other organizations. And this is a moment where all of us can do something to participate, to use our power, to encourage others to be involved in our democracy, to get out and vote, and to hold up this nation to live up to its ideals.
Absolutely. Congressman, thank you so much for your time and for your passion on this topic. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Look forward to seeing everybody at the march. Take care.